Welcome to another episode of the ASEF podcast. Today we will be talking with two experts in the field of political and educational sociology. With us are Professor Tamara Trošt, who is an associate professor of sociology at the School of Economics and Business at the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia, and Professor Manja Klemenčič, who is an associate senior lecturer on sociology and general education at Harvard University. And myself, Tanja Janko, I am a chemist and ASEF fellow from the year of 2019. Thank you very much for joining us today. And let's start the conversation with when did studying and researching sociology first spark your interest? And why did you choose to devote yourself to studying these topics?
Okay, so maybe I'll start first. So for me, one of the big moments was when I was in college, and in the US, you don't have to choose right away in college what you'll study. But I had a little brother at home in Serbia who, at the time, all this stuff with Kosovo was going on. And I noticed that among his friends, some of them were very nationalistic and others were very kind of loving and accepting. And it raises question of how did kids learn this, or why are some of these kids more tolerant already in 5th grade or 6th grade? Are their parents doing something, or what explains this difference? And that kind of was a question that compelled me, first of all, to start the PhD. With that question, I could have also done psychology, I could have done sociology, political science. There's different fields cover this. And I started off in political science, but it ended up being too focused on the government level. And I really wanted to spend time talking to the kids themselves. So I ended up switching to sociology after the master's. So that's it in a nutshell.
In my case, I have never really chosen sociology directly. I have started with economics in Maribor and have proceeded with master's and PhD in European studies and political studies, but in that context, I have always combined political science and political sociology. But what is really that drew me through all of those years is interest in quality of higher education and improvement of higher education. And that started already in my times in Maribor, where during the 90s, it was not very quality higher education provision. And I had gone away for a year to the United States to study abroad in my junior year and have realized that education at the higher education level can look a little bit differently, not necessarily just rote learning, memorization, massive lectures. And from then on, when I returned back to Slovenia a year after, I started working in various capacities towards improvement of education. And I partnered with the student organizations, and I formed a debate club, and later on became a lobbyist, a secretary general of the European Students' Union, again fighting for student interests to have quality education. And it was through that work that then, after my PhD, I have continued my research in sociology and politics of higher education. So I'm more of a higher education specialist, but I come into study of higher education from the sociological and political science perspectives.
Thank you very much. So now, if I just briefly introduce the background of you two, and Manja, you already kind of gave an insight into what your background is, so let me just quickly repeat it. So Professor Klemencic received bachelor's degree in economics at the University of Maribor, and then she moved to the University of Cambridge, where she obtained master's in European studies and PhD in international studies. She researches, teaches, advises, and acts as a consultant in sociology and politics of higher education, European higher education, as well as comparative higher education. She also won several awards for excellence in teaching at Harvard. And Professor Trost holds a PhD in sociology from Harvard University and master's in political science. Her research interests include nationalism, ethnic identity, youth values, with a geographical focus on Western Balkans, and qualitative and mixed methods, Previously, she was a visiting professor at the University of Graz and spent 2015 to 2016 years as a Fung Fellow at Princeton University. Let's start with our first question for Professor Trošt. So, your research focuses on nationalism, ethnic identity, and youth values in Western Balkans. Can you share some key insights or trends that you have discovered in your studies and how they relate to broader socio-political dynamics in the region? How do you draw a distinction between patriotism and nationalism?
Hi, thanks for the question. So this might be a little bit difficult to summarize very briefly, but so far what I've been mostly focused on is what are children and your youth learning in schools and how what they learn about what it means to be Slovenian or Serbian or Croatian actually affects how they develop. And related to that, whether there are differences in, for instance, how our parents' generation thought about being Slovenian and how the new generation thinks about being Slovenian, and to what extent ethnic identity, we can approach it in the same way. And maybe later we can get to the issues of measuring ethnic identity, but this was kind of the main thing I started off with. So in my research, I looked at not just at schools, I also looked at what churches are doing and how religious institutions are defining this, and then sports hooligans and what happens when sports starts defining what it means to be Serbian or what it means to be Slovenian. So I tried to look at all the different ways in which identity can be shaped kind of from the outside. That would be my short answer.
Now, Professor Klemencic, considering the political and economic transition in Central and Eastern European countries over the past few decades, how has it influenced the reform and diversity of higher education systems? Specifically, what role do factors such as state funding, knowledge policies, and such influence, of course, the influence of European Union play in this context?
Thank you for this question. Before I answer it, let me just say that there are certain parallels with Tamara's work as well. She's focusing on the school children. I'm focusing on the students in the higher education context, who have been through the schooling and through indoctrination and identity building that Tamara is looking at. So lots of my work is really focusing nowadays on the student agency in the context of higher education, where I look specifically about how students are able to navigate their higher education spaces and influence those higher education spaces and their own trajectories, including their engagement as citizens in society, not just as agents within the context of higher education. So I'm looking at that now as well in the context. I will be looking at this question also in the context of Slovenia, which I haven't studied for a while, but I have over the years, of course, followed the broader developments as a scholar of European higher education. So to answer your question, I would say that, of course, the influence of the Bologna process and the European Union on the higher education policies and the practices within the context of Slovenia specifically and our region was significant. It was, I would say, in terms of the Bologna, although the recommendations or the Bologna commitments are voluntary for the member states to implement them, it is a powerful normative framework where soft power prevails of naming and shaming and benchmarking with reports, checking how each country is doing in implementing different Bologna objectives. So, of course, we have been a good pupil, as Slovenians tend to be, in applying the Bologna commitments. With the European Union uses similar soft power instruments with recommendations and benchmarking. But, of course, the European Union also has the power of the purse. So, through a variety of financial instruments, namely the calls for proposals and funding, lots of ideas and policies that the European Union would like to promote are then diffused into the national context. And again, this is how, in the current context, the countries are adopting or are introducing European university alliances. Both of our major universities, University of Ljubljana and University of Maribor, are members of the European University Alliances, which is a flagship initiative of the European Union. We are very much active in the context of promoting digital education and green education. Again, those were two of the major objectives that were stated within the European Union strategy for universities that has been applied last year. So I would say massive influences, important diffusion of ideas from the European context down to the national and down to the institutional. Maybe again, turning back to students as I conclude, I would say that students have in fact been major players in making those reforms happen, because they were a protagonist for the Bologna reforms and in general for the reforms that they believed will contribute to the quality of higher education and access to higher education. So European Students' Union that I mentioned before, and correspondingly Slovenian Student Union have been important partners, members of the Bologna process, and are important stakeholders and advocates for the reforms that we are seeing now in Slovenia and in the broader region of Central and Eastern Europe.
Thank you. Professor Trost, as an expert in qualitative and mixed methods, what are these approaches' unique strengths and advances in understanding complex social phenomena such as patriotism, nationalism, and memory politics? And maybe let's just begin by defining what memory politics actually are.
Okay, great. So maybe I'll start off actually with the first part of your questions with the methods, because the methods come in much more when we're thinking about studying ethnic identity or nationalism. So I'm a big supporter of mixed methods, so using quantitative approaches for particular problems and qualitative for other kinds of problems. And I'll give you maybe an example just on one of the things I study, like ethnic identity. So if we wanted to study ethnic identity quantitatively, what you normally see is a survey in which somebody asks you, for instance, how proud are you to be Slovenian from 1 to 6? So not very proud, somewhat proud, very proud, extremely proud. Or they'll ask you, how strongly attached do you feel towards the European Union from 1 to 5? Or they'll give you a range of identities like Slovenian, Central European, European, and then you rank the identities. So you essentially end up getting numbers. The qualitative approaches to ethnic identity would be if you actually sit down and talk to people and try to figure out, okay, so even if I ask you, you feel a 4 on pride from being Slovenian from 1 to 5. I'm not interested in a number. I want to actually see how being a Slovenian matters in your daily life. So maybe I will do classroom observation, or I'll see in which ways students even use ethnic identity in that way. So where ethnic identity is concerned, I really do think qualitative approaches are maybe better. But then you can't really have a generalizable study. So you can study, let's say, a group of high schoolers in Maribor, but you won't be able to speak about what this is like with students in Serbia or Croatia or in some other city in Slovenia. So you get deep and rich context, but you don't get the generalizability. So it's basically a trade-off between the two. And with ethnic identity, you have really good research doing both. And I really think that both are needed. When you get to this other field, you mentioned memory politics. For memory politics, I would say we study much more, we use qualitative methods more. So we're interested, for instance, okay, so during socialism, we were all taught a certain thing about, let's say, Jasenovac or Bleiburg, Kleberg. And then over 10, 20, 30, 40 years, the narrative about these events slowly changed. So we can now say, okay, so what happened? Let me give you an example. In Serbia, where we had these Chetniks and partisans, 20 years ago, you would say, okay, who were anti-fascists and who were fascists? And you would group them. And now all of a sudden, 30 years later, you have some groups that my generation was taught were fascists. And now all of a sudden, they're being taught as being anti-fascists, right? So memory politics is concerned with how does this happen? So what are the politics that affect why memory gets adapted or changed in particular ways over time? And those we study usually with qualitative approaches. So we'll look at public speeches, commemorations, monuments, public holidays, calendar dates, school excursions, days of remembrance, and we'll see how those change over time or how they were changed. And in the context of the European Union, it's actually really interesting because the European Union actually has its own memory framework. So the European Union does have its own kind of version of how we should remember. So how should the Holocaust be remembered, or how should particular things be remembered? And of course, countries that are member states of the EU then have a better, let's say, playing card in shaping this than countries that are outside of the EU. So you saw these issues with Greece and North Macedonia. Again, it was over memory. but the politics come into play because one of the members has veto power and the other one is trying to be an EU state. So that's where the politics then come into play. And the Europeanization process has added another level of politics to the memory part.
This was very interesting. And how exactly do this memory politics then work, or how do they, change? For example of Slovenia, maybe the education for middle school, for example.
Yeah. So for instance, you could say, okay, Pliberg, for instance, Bleiburg, are you teaching kids that Bleiburg was an event where the defeated forces in World War II? So that's where they captured people who were collaborating with the fascists, and some of them got killed on this long march back. Or are you teaching them, like it's taught in some textbooks in Croatia, that this was a tragedy of the Croatian people, right? So are you framing Pliberg as an event where fascist collaborators were shot, or where innocent Croatian or just the Croatian people were shot, right? Because that then teaches kids to either feel like victims, like this was a place where some really big injustice, some grave injustice was committed against them, or are you teaching it in the way that I think it should be taught, in a way to just realize the horrors of war in general, right? So not teaching they were the good bad guys, we're the bad guys, and we're always the ones getting the worst of everything, which is normally how most of the countries in the area teach their history. Or are you teaching kids to learn about this episode from history and take something from it that could be constructive? Not that's like, we as Croats suffered in Pliberg and all of these Croatian innocent people were killed, and the communists didn't let us celebrate these crimes or didn't let us acknowledge this for 40 years. So the narrative is what ends up leaving also an emotional trace on the kids who are learning it. And what I argue in my research, that it's really not good for kids to be learn this kind of victimization narrative and feeling like injustice was done, because then they feel like some injustice needs to be corrected, usually in violent ways. So
thank you very much for your answer. And kind of continuing with in the same direction, Professor Klemencic, how do educational institutions respond to and navigate controversies and debates such as those that are related to identity politics, multiculturalism, and historical narratives?
This is an interesting and complex question. Maybe first I should say that I have very much appreciated what Tamara was talking about, the approach that schools should be taking in discussing historical moments and countering the culture of victimization. Because if the schools do so and follow Tamara's advice, the students that come into our higher education institutions will be much more open-minded and critically minded, and will not fall into the pitfalls of adopting victimhood narrative for themselves, and will be much more constructive. So I very much appreciated what she has said. As to educational institutions, the example of my own university, Harvard University, at the moment is Harvard University is reckoning with the legacy of slavery and kind of starting a process of discussions across the campus about visual images that are portrayed across the universities, and what kind of narratives and what kind of messages and symbols they bring forward. There is, of course, a lot of discussion about what it is that we teach, what literature we bring to our students, and what, again, are the hidden messages or implicit curriculum that it is in those, and how we choose what our students read and how they discuss. So there are, of course, very different approaches. My only advice would be, please don't copy in Slovenia what Americans are doing, because, of course, Americans have their own historical narratives, historical pathways, their own controversies, which are not necessarily directly applicable to our context. We have to deal with ours, such as those that Tamara is researching. I really want to caution against, just copy-pasting diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives as the Americans are doing it, and putting them into European universities and colleges, because they will not be appropriate. And they are controversial also in this space. There's a big debate here, including at Harvard, whether diversity statements as required by the university or recommended by the universities are an appropriate way of hiring professors, and whether they do support the academic freedom. So I just want to kind of put a word of caution, having experienced in this country an encroachment on academic freedom in higher education context, and this encroachment has done with all good intentions that we usually see, good intentions of diversifying faculty, good intentions of having more equity and inclusion in the classrooms, but sometimes they can go overboard. So I just want to say that academic freedom is precious and has to be cultivated, and probably in our own context in Central Eastern Europe, in Slovenia, in Croatia, in Serbia, we are better prepared to preserve it, because we still remember the times when during the totalitarian regimes the freedom of inquiry, the civil discourse across differences were curbed, and we see this kind of threats to academic freedom in the United States, in higher education institutions in the United States, and we see it also in other parts of the world. So yes, higher education institutions have a major challenge to navigate societies which are highly politically fragmented and cultivate and maintain the principles of academic freedom, of free inquiry, of intellectual diversity, and of civil discourse. That would be my message, and especially the message that we have to be critical ourselves also in our own countries, like in Slovenia, what it is that we are adopting especially from the United States, because of very different cultural and historical pathways that have brought us here.
No, thank you very much. Professor Trošt, would you mind elaborating how collective memory and commemorative practices shape social and political processes in the context of Europeanization and memory politics? How do you think what is the best way to deal with subjective nature of memory and its role in shaping historical narratives?
Okay, so I think I might have already answered some of that question, some parts of your question earlier. So in the region, what we can see with memory politics is, let's say, the effect of the EU and the Europeanization processes. And maybe I'll give an example. I have an edited volume where there were 2 really good chapters on this, looking at Holocaust or World War II commemoration in Croatia. And the EU now has this framework of we shall never forget about the Holocaust, and the Holocaust is kind of the center of this memory framework. And Croatia, and let's say the Jasenovac Memorial in Croatia, has now redone its exhibitions, and it's all about this European Holocaust memory we shall never forget. But in essence, what happens when you go there is that local traces of Holocaust memory are erased. So in a way, Croatia was able to or the Croatian Jasenovac Memorial Museum was able to package what happened in Jasenovac as this European Holocaust tragedy and absolve itself from responsibility. And what do we actually do? What do the local people actually do? And it's similar in Serbia, where there's not very much talk of what happened to Jewish victims. So there's this one concentration camp, Staro Sajmište, that we don't talk a lot about because mostly Jews were killed there during World War II. And the focus is on, let's say, Jasenovac, where Serbs were also the victims. So there you see kind of a victimhood Olympics game. So who were the bigger victims? But in terms of your question, I would say the effect of the EU memory framework on the way Croatia was able to shape its own memory politics is really the most telling, because it's supposed to be, saying that the Holocaust was a uniquely traumatic event is supposed to be something that's going to help us prevent something like that happening again. But what it has done actually is it's enabled other kinds of memory that are not really commendable. So, for instance, again, avoiding local responsibility or discussing how did local Croats or how did local Serbs or local Slovenians actually participate in this. There's also one other thing that's happening. It's called the two totalitarianisms narrative, in which over time now communism is portrayed as so bad and that the communism is another totalitarian regime. So basically you had Nazism and communism, and they were equally as bad. So people who were fighting, or groups who were fighting Nazism, who are fighting communists, but were actually collaborating with Nazis, become good guys, right? Because you're now framing communists as equally bad as Nazis. So those are some developments that then happen, and they actually have an effect on day-to-day life, because if you start relativizing people who collaborated with Nazis on account that they were against the communists, right, you get to a point where the history of World War II is rewritten, and it's not in a way that's going to prevent something like this happening in the future. So that's just one example, but there are many.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And now we will shift the conversation a little bit towards the vision about Slovenia. And so in this part, I would like both of you just to contribute to the question. So firstly, let me ask, how does brain circulation, where academics and professionals gain experiences outside of Slovenia, contribute to strengthening of the nation? Since both of you were studying at least partially outside, and now for you, Professor Klemencic, you are working at Harvard. So what are the upsides and downsides in your opinion?
I would say that, of course, there are upsides and there are downsides. In my own case, I have always maintained a very strong relationship to Slovenia, even throughout my entire academic journey outside. I've always retained the visiting status at the School of Education at the University of Ljubljana, at the Center of Educational Policy Studies, where I had most colleagues that were involved in the similar type of research as mine. So, of course, we as Slovenians brought a connection between the research that happens in the US or in the European context and the home academic community. We probably lose out because we don't publish so much in Slovenian language, specifically targeting Slovenian readers. But I think that even that is becoming diminished because of the high language skills of the Slovenian students and researchers in general. In my case, I should say that I'm on the way back. I'm starting my sabbatical at School of Education, Pedagoška fakulteta in the University of Ljubljana, basically next week. So this is another way how do we maintain this kind of connections. And Slovenian government has this wonderful program of via Ad Futura of supporting gostovanja, visiting professorships of Slovenians who are active academia abroad to come and spend sabbatical year. So I'm going to be launching my new research project on student agency in the context of European University Alliances, with case study of University of Ljubljana as part of Etopia University Alliance. So this is the way that we maintain the connection. So I would say that it's helpful if we have people outside, because this is how we can cross-fertilize the knowledge and broaden the net of the ideas. And I think that especially with outreach of the government with this supportive initiative, helping bring Slovenians back, at least for a period of time, but also with the outreach of individual higher education institutions, like the University of Ljubljana has the specific program to bring us together, and Maribor is working on this as well. I think this is much more helpful and much more productive than it would otherwise be. So that would be kind of I would be very supportive of continuing your work, specifically of ASEF, and the work of similar associations, plus the outreach activities of the government and of the higher education institutions, so that we can tighten the connections with those that are abroad. So I'm definitely going to come back, and I might be back for longer. So that's I'm not going to say more, but definitely here for a year in Ljubljana. Actually, mostly in Prlekija at home, but working with colleagues in Ljubljana and coming in, supervise some doctoral students as well.
Well, Manja, I'm looking forward to seeing you for lunch or coffee.
Same, likewise.
So yes, I agree with what Manja said. I think a very big difference from the US and most of European education system is in the US, it's by definition open. It's by definition circulating, almost to a point where it's too circulating, right? So you finish your PhD in one place, then you go, let's say, do a postdoc somewhere else, then you do tenure track in a third place, and very, very rarely do you actually get tenure in the place where you did your tenure track. So you do assistant professorship at one place, then you get the full professorship somewhere else. So people are always circulating, and it really is to a point where academics in the US have problems, setting up a family, buying a house, whatever, because you're every 6 years you're moving. In Slovenia, like Manja said, there are actually a lot of ways you can leave or come back for 1 year. Unfortunately, it's much harder to do something more permanent for more years at a time. So when I left for Princeton for a year, a couple of years ago, it was an amazing fellowship. It covered everything from moving costs, helping find daycare for my daughter, everything. So it was a great fellowship, but I had to freeze my contract in Ljubljana, and you can only freeze your contract for 1 year. So I came back after 1 year, and I'm really glad I came back to the job I had. But if I wanted to, let's say, go for 3 or 4 years, it's probably a zero chance that I would be able to come back to the University of Ljubljana and have an occupied job there again, right? Because these actual job openings are very rare. The ones that are stable and guaranteed under quotation marks, there are not very many of them, right? Because people are not circulating. So you don't have, in the US, the job market opens and the job market is created, like all of these institutions, all of these new openings, you apply to 20 different, right? So it's much more here. There will be a job opening, but very, very rarely. So you can't really risk leaving for a longer period of time. So that's kind of maybe the ups and downs there. But I think it's great that there are these programs where you can go for a year and you can come back after a year. And ASEF is really great also in sending students, to go be mentored by somebody, come back. Because what you said was brain circulation, and that's really what we want. We don't want brain drain where it's just going one direction or the other. You want a circulation happening, and government programs and ASEF programs and ASEF NGOs all really make a difference with whether this is possible or not.
Yes, I agree that ASEF is doing an amazing work. So my next question would be, Slovenians had a heterogeneous historical experience, partially conditioned by their geographic location. So for example, Slovenians who live in Slovenia live different realities than Slovenians who are living in Trost, Gorica on Italian side, or Koroška towards Austria. And furthermore, Slovenians who are living abroad also live a very different reality. How do you think then that mobility programs can integrate the attentiveness to communities that are outside of Slovenia to promote cross-cultural understanding and collaboration?
Perhaps I can start with that. Of course, the whole purpose of mobility is to achieve that purpose, right, of enhancing the cross-cultural understanding. And mobility programs are really very, very well developed, like Tamara said, here in the European context, from the Erasmus program funded by the European Union, but also our Urad za Slovence v zamejstvu is organizing various activities for school children. I always had my own children come to Slovenia and be in this camp for Slovenians abroad to learn Slovenian language. So that part, I think it's functioned really well because there are so many instruments through the Erasmus mobilities, through the Ad Futura scholarships, through the work of the Urad za Slovence v zamejstvu. Where the problems lie is what Tamara said before, the rigidity of the academic market of Slovenia in order to enable and encourage and make it possible or attractive for people to return into academic and research careers. So this is where much more work needs to be done, and the kind of a rigidity in general in terms of hiring, but also rigidity in terms of not being able to leave for longer, like in Tamara's case. So I think that part really requires, but I am able to put my children now into gymnasia, proper Slovenska gymnasia, also because of those programs that have been offered to them in the summers, that they could go into the camps and they were learning Slovenian online as well. So I'm putting them to Druga Gimnazija in Maribor. My youngest one goes to the first year and the older one into the third year, and will manage. Even though we are bilingual family, we are not only Slovenian speaking family. My husband is not Slovenian, but they will manage, and they are not afraid just because they were they were taking advantage of the mobility programs and opportunities offered to the students.
Yeah, I would just repeat what Manja said. So basically, these mobility programs are there to make these connections, and maybe like Manja said. So right now, the University of Ljubljana is really the kind of the biggest heads all of these mobility efforts. So probably in the future, if we get the other universities in Slovenia to have similar programs, that'll help with the other regions of Slovenia as well. So it's not just Ljubljana centric, because frequently when you talk about exchanges, you're talking about Ljubljana. But exactly, the Erasmus mobility, the programs that are funded. So I really don't want to repeat this too many times, but ASEF does one of the. It's actually very rare to have an NGO that fosters this kind of exchange. So you guys put Slovenian professors abroad in the spotlight, students who go to visit Slovenian professors, or them coming back, you put them in the spotlight, right? So, but it's done in a way that's not nationalistic or nation centric. It's in a really, really positive way, and then so ASEF has its own fellowships for this, and this is exactly what we need. So some kind of actual logistically supported programs and funding that will allow this. Because if we talk about mobility, and you're not talking about things like how are you going to handle logistics, what's the procedure for, let's say, enrolling somebody in high school, who's going to help you do the bureaucracy, how are you going to get a visa settled, because many Slovenians who live overseas don't have, let's say, Slovenian citizenship, or what are they going to do with taxes, who will help them do all of these logistical things, and also give funding. Because especially when we're talking about early career scholars, without funding, none of this can happen, right? They need to know, we're not talking also about just one person moving. It's very frequently a person, their spouse, their kids. So making this actually possible, not just on paper, let's circulate and do mobility, but say, how does this actually work out logistically? Is this even possible? Is it possible for people who don't have a spouse who will watch the kids full time, right? So all of these assumptions that make it only open to some people and not to others. But I think we're making really big steps to slowly making that happen.
So now we are slowly coming towards the end of the podcast, and I would just like to return quickly back to the previous section where we're not talking about Slovenia specifically and the mobility programs. But in the conversation, you both mentioned this victim mentality, and Manja, you talked a little bit about the problems of academic freedom. Would you mind expanding a little bit on that and the impact of these issues? So victim mentality, and what are the challenges of academic freedom?
I would say I'm mostly experiencing them in the classroom, where students are self-censoring out of fear to unintentionally offend somebody on something that they have said in the classroom, and they don't want to be then named racist or transphobic just for the comment. So they're self-censoring, and what we have is that students are just not speaking, and if they're holding back, we're missing out on learning opportunities in the classroom. I'm teaching controversial topics at Harvard, probably not as controversial as Tamara's topics of research, but I'm teaching higher education and controversies here with Harvard undergraduates. And one of the major concerns I have, and my colleagues increasingly, is that students are just not willing to speak about things that are controversial out of that fear. So I have to scaffold or create, pedagogical scaffolding very carefully in order to encourage open discussion across the differences, and to cultivate the culture of constructive disagreement, because students frankly are not willing to take that risk, and I have to convince them to take that risk in order to gain the advantages of learning. And the way that I do that is I'm basically putting them into debates, and I'm assigning them sides. So I'm creating this kind of debate games And the level where we are, that's what I'm telling them, is that you don't disclose your personal opinion, but we are unraveling the arguments on the issues such as affirmative action in access to elite higher education. That would be one, or use of diversity statements in recruitment of faculty, and similar, or diversity, inclusion, and belonging practices in higher education. This is another controversial topic. So I'm actually have to prompt them, ask them not to disclose personal opinion, because I don't think, one, whether they will be willing to speak, and I don't know if I can deal with the cultural wars that might occur if we have a situation where people are speaking. So they debate without disclosing their personal position. We unravel arguments, evidence, but it's difficult. It is really difficult. And this culture of constructive disagreement is something that we have to work for actively and purposefully. So this is how I have structured my classes. And the other way that we can empower them, of course, helping them with critical thinking. It's also to help them to do inquire, to become researchers themselves. I liked very much the way that Tamara was talking earlier as well about the methods in my courses, which mostly are research intensive courses. I teach students how to conduct research in the topics, which then gives them a little bit more in-depth exposure into issues of higher education, and I find it in a way empowering. On the side, what I have done as well is I have applied the same practice of teaching students how to do research with student leaders globally. So my latest project is empowering student leaders, teaching them social science research methods in order to do research into student politics. And that kind of process of preparing them to become researchers is empowering as well, but it also kind of makes them less seeing the world in black and white, because through research you all never get the straight answers, and you have to kind of understand the complexity of social processes and social interactions. And I think it contributes as well to this dealing with the controversies as well. So that would be, but it's very, very difficult at the moment. And I painfully remember it from the times, from the 90s, when we were in the situations where people self-censored for another reasons, but now they're self-censoring out of fear of being cancelled, basically.
May I just ask a question on so you mentioned the quantitative research methods that you are teaching your students. So how do you think that then their personal stance on the topics that they are researching is impact the interpretation of results?
That's the neutrality, of course, is a big question. One thing that Tamara probably does the same, we remind them of their positionality. This is where we start the discussion, where we stand, why we have chosen the question that we have chosen, what is our own stance, what is our own positionality in relation to that particular question. And then they have to really actively think about how they will be creating their research methodology so that they will be open and neutral. So we have to go through that. This is a part of the scaffolding in their research project, that they go through those processes of thinking and verbalizing their own positionality in relation to the research question they have chosen. This, of course, requires a lot of work, Tanya. That means I meet with each student individually in the processes of finding their research question. I'm their critical friend, pushing them back if they see that they are just trying to research something that they already have answers on, and they just hope to confirm what they already believe that they observe. But this is the beautiful moment where the actual learning happens and where actual opening of the mind happens, because they realize, well, they are actually people that I believe, even in many of them do research on their student groups and organizations where they think that they know everything and it's going to be easy. And this is where they find surprises when they realize that they just haven't had proper conversation to understand how people, their colleagues, think about the issues. So it's really our role as educators, Tamara and I, to work back to the students and prompt them to reconsider why they're doing it, and whether they might be some unintended or intended biases. And we remind them of the major biases in social science research, including those that can occur how we formulate survey questions, how we list the survey questions. So it's a big, but it's a very important process as part of the being a student in higher education and developing as a researcher as well.
Yeah, so as Manja was speaking, I had all these thoughts. So I wanted to start off with where Manja started. Her answer, I also at Harvard, I led, when I was there, led these workshops on how to teach sensitive topics or how to teach hot button issues. And they're very different. That was, 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago than today, because today, so at that point it was, okay, so if I'm going to really encourage a debate on something that's controversial and one student says something that's really racist or really sexist, I as a teacher have to step in to kind of protect students in the classroom who could be hurt or by what was said, right? So you already are in a position where it's not just, are you worried that students will say something offensive? It's that you actually have to be a buffer and make sure that you handle those situations in a way that will be overall then constructive, both for the person who risked saying their opinion and the person who could have been hurt by that opinion. And that's a very tricky position. But now it's even more tricky because, and I know my professor friends in the US have the same. So if a student, let's say, audio tapes your video records, and just the fact that I said audio tape shows how old I am. So you record on your phone. Let's say the professor is speaking or saying something, or put it on Twitter. Even professors, it's not just students. Professors are also in this place where so what Manja was explaining happens to students, where you don't want to say something because you don't want to offend. You're afraid of basically saying your opinion. Is that professors are also in the same position where, with social media and everything, things could easily be taken out of context. So one of the things that we used to do is, okay, let me play devil's advocate and say all these arguments that are potentially offensive. I wouldn't even do it that way. The way Manja does it, it sounds interesting because you don't want it to turn out that you said something offensive or racist. And something like that did happen to me last year when I was teaching methods, and I was showing in a methods class, I was showing examples of my research on how I research nationalism in the Balkans and how you could do it using Instagram photos. And there was a picture of, a Serbian football fan holding up 3 fingers. Anyway, it was a very nationalist symbol. And I was using it to show how could you analyze this qualitatively or quantitatively. So it was a method discussion. But later, one of the students said that she felt hurt by that. She asked if I could not show a picture of somebody holding 3 fingers. And, so the point that was a methods point that was, okay, if I want to study nationalism, how can I study it? It was not that I'm in any way, shape, or form supporting the use of showing 3 fingers. Right. But it can be taken out of context. And then it's just safer for me. And this year I just deleted that photograph from the slides because it was safer. Right. But what happens is what Manja said is if everybody goes on into what's safer, because you don't want to be called out as a racist or a homophobe or whatever, then things. I mean, I, of course, think that as a society, this is positive steps. But in the classroom, what happens is that you can actually stop critical debate. So that's one part of it. And the second part I wanted to mention is this aspect of critical thinking, which I definitely think we don't have enough of in Slovenia. And I see my daughter who's in elementary school and the kids that I teach in high school and university. Sometimes when I ask students at the university level to write out their opinion or their position on something, they'll say it's the first time they were asked to do this, right? Which is crazy to me because, we should be asking them to argue their position. That would make them much better at actually forming arguments, being able to filter out what is their opinion and what is, a scientific fact. And they don't get enough practice doing this. And that's, I think, a legacy of the school systems all over the post-Yugoslav space, is that this aspect of, raise your hand and say something a little bit out there, put out your position. It's really not encouraged. And I think that maybe going back to what you said with the mobility program, I think this is great because I teach a class at Ph.D, social sciences. And there you have, lots of Slovenian students and then some Erasmus students. And we're talking about sociological, touchy topics. And the Erasmus students are always like raising their hand and giving their opinion and saying all these things. And the Slovenian students are taken aback. But it does shake things up a bit because the students that come on mobility have a completely different, way of interacting. So I think it has a good effect on the classroom because it maybe makes the Slovenians less afraid of also, standing out and giving their opinion or just putting themselves out there. I see this in elementary school. It's do not put yourself out there. Be average, right? So just don't stand out. And this is maybe one of the things. It's kind of a corollary to the part about being afraid of saying something offensive, but we want to foster this debate. And the question is how to make it happen. And the thing I'll end with is that Manja knows from teaching at Harvard how much is put into looking at what are the classroom sizes, how can you actually have debates. And I'm at this position where I have a course on sociology and culture at the economics faculty. And it's great that I can teach economics students sociological issues. So of course I ask open-ended essay questions for the exam. So I'll ask them to, write out a sheet of paper with a response. But then I have 100 essays that I have to grade, or in some classes it's 300 essays. And in the end, you end up just putting into multiple choice because it's just, there's too many students for you to be able to actually read their essays, engage with what they're doing. And in Manja, for me, this was shocking. At Harvard, every single thing a student turns in, you can't just say excellent A. You say, you raise good points on A, B, and C. What you could improve is blah, blah, blah. And in Slovenia, you simply say you got a 9 out of 10. End of story. No feedback. Maybe the student will come to your office hours asking you for feedback, but you do not automatically provide feedback. So this loop is non-existent here. But it's not because it's not good. It's that it's worse. It's just because we have so many students that it's not feasible, right? So maybe that's where I'll end with.
Excellent points, and I agree with a lot of the things that you two said. And maybe just for the very last question, what books would you advise to those who are interested in digging deeper in the set of topics that we discussed today?
Maybe I'll start because I hear what Tamara is saying and the lack of the manpower to actually offer smaller seminars, and because we have here teaching fellows, I have 100 students in my gen ed as well, but I don't grade all of the 3 essays per student per term. We have teaching fellows who each has 15 students per section, so it's really, this has to be reconsidered. So I'm prepping to make a self-recommendation, a kind of a self-promotion with a colleague from St. Gallen from Switzerland. We have edited a handbook, Routledge Handbook, on student-centered learning and teaching in higher education, which speaks to some of the issues that Tamara has raised in terms of how student-centered instruction actually works, what are the good practices, what works in the large classroom and what doesn't, appealing for the smaller sections where this discussions can happen and things like that. So that would be one of my recommendations as well. If I can give another one, it's not directly related to higher education, but it's just something I'm reading right now. And that's the book by David Goodhart, The Road to Somewhere. And I find it important and relevant to higher education because what David Goodhart is trying to affirm is the importance of not forgetting the professions and people who work in the professions that are not usually thought of as most prestigious. Thinking about the plumbers and the nurses and the people in agriculture, and to affirm the value of studying for those professions, the institutions that offer them, and the professions themselves, the worth that they give to the societies. I'm very much, I'm consulting a lot the European Union on various higher education policies, and one of the messages that I'm trying to put across, and it's resonating now in the policies, is that we need to value all types of higher education institutions. Research universities, of course, have a very important role, but there are other programs as well that specifically educate for professions, the professions that help society work on a daily basis, the electricians, the plumbers, the carpenters, everybody in construction, everybody in agriculture, and those professions and those study programs should not be forgotten. They should be also promoted, they should be invested in, they should be valued. So they should be kind of symbolically, we need to affirm them as important part and worthy of studying. So not everybody needs to go to research universities. People can also study for the trades and the professions that help our societies work and be so. So that would be my second recommendation.
Your question is really, really difficult, but maybe since sociology actually here in Slovenia, at the University of Ljubljana, it's at Filozofska and Fedova, but there are very few students actually studying sociology. So what I would recommend to anybody listening is a book by one of my friends called You May Ask Yourself, An Introduction to Thinking Like a Sociologist. So this You May Ask Yourself, it's by Dalton Conley. It kind of goes through what is seeing life around you and understanding how sociology explains some of the things. And it's aging, health, inequality, death, all of these things. So I would say that would be a really good place to start, because what I see very frequently at the economics faculty is that many people just have absolutely no idea that these things exist as categories of analysis, right? So that's where I would start. You may ask yourself. And then if you find something in there that's really interesting, the topics. For me, when I was at Harvard, I was a TA for Nicholas Christakis, and he was teaching the sociology of life and death. And it was super interesting, right? I never knew about any of that might have been one of the courses, you know, as a TA for it, that stuck in my head about how all these interesting things that sociology actually can explain. So that would be my recommendation. But if anybody's listening, you can feel free to send me an email and I will send you a much longer list, because there's so many great books out there.
Tanya, can I just jump in? Something came to my mind. There was a recently published Festschrift for Pavel Zgaga, From Actors to Reforms in European Higher Education. So if interested in European higher education, there was a tribute to our great scholar of higher education, Pavel Zgaga, from Pedagoška fakulteta, and it also touches on a broad variety of the topics I have spoken here today: academic freedom and the reforms and the Bologna and the role of the European Union and all of that. And it has been published last year as well. So the Festschrift for Pavel Zgaga, From Actors to Reforms in European Higher Education. Sorry for this extra, but I just thought I'll mention as well.
Thank you both very much for your recommendations and for taking the time to have the conversation.
Thank you for inviting us. And Manja, please say hi when you're in Slovenia.
Absolutely. I will be in touch. It was a very interesting conversation. Thank you all, and thank you to the listeners of ASEF podcast.